Hi, I'm Mr. Nance. We've been looking at the Scarlet Letter and at romanticism and how it applies to the Scarlet Letter, but now it's time to look a little bit more in depth. What actually is going on inside the Scarlet Letter? The Scarlet Letter centers around four major characters: Hester, Dimmesdale, Pearl, and Chillingworth. Each of these characters is responding to an action that happens before the book begins, the sin between Hester and Dimmesdale of adultery, the sin for which she's marked with the Scarlet Letter. All these characters are dealing with the idea of guilt, but they deal with it in different ways. Hester is directly accused of the crime of adultery. She's can't escape it because she's had a child. And so she's publicly ridiculed at the beginning of the book and permanently marked. For the rest of her life, she must carry around a scarlet letter. For the rest of her life, she's going to be known as the adulteress. On the other hand, we have Dimmesdale, who hides his sin. He keeps hidden from his guilt. And yet at the same time, we see that one of the most important progressions of action within the book is the fact that Dimmesdale cannot get over the guilt. Hester, because she has to wear it in front, out for everyone to see, has to deal with it for the rest of her life, but she deals with it in a much more positive way than Dimmesdale. The guilt eats up Dimmesdale's soul, causes him torment day and night, and leads him to desperation, as opposed to Hester, who grows stronger from it, who learns how to use this mark as a way of strengthening herself and purifying herself. The other two characters who also deal with this same event are Pearl, who is Hester's child, and Chillingworth. Pearl must deal with this, but she deals with it as an innocent would. She does not have any responsibility for the guilt, and yet at the same time the guilt still weighs down upon her. She is the child of sin, and so therefore she's guilty just by being born. But at the same time she's also a child, so she's innocent. She's done nothing wrong. This complexity and this paradox creates Pearl's character and makes her very complex. She doesn't appear to be human for most of the book because she has no way to connect to humanity. She's been cut off from humanity by the action of her mother before her birth, and she has also been cut off from humanity by her lack of a father in Dimmesdale, and so throughout this she's struggling with being human. One of the big questions raised throughout this book is, will she ever have the opportunity to become human and experience true human emotions? On the other hand, we have Chillingworth, who is Hester's husband. Chillingworth is a very complex character. He responds to the guilt by directly attacking Dimmesdale, but in a very subtle way. He sneaks into Dimmesdale's life and pretends to be a doctor so that he can spend all of his time with Dimmesdale and manipulate Dimmesdale's emotions. He never tells Dimmesdale who he is. He merely stays with him and constantly picks at the sore on his soul, this guilt of the adultery. He keeps Dimmesdale hidden, and this secret hidden, so that he can torment him more and more than a confession ever would. So Chillingworth, by attempting to destroy Dimmesdale's soul, becomes associated with evil. He takes on the characteristics of the Black Man, or the Satan figure from Puritan society. At the same time, Chillingworth is more complex than simply a symbol for the devil. We see that there is a positive side to Chillingworth. There is a tragic side to Chillingworth that shows its face from time to time. And if I have a chance, we'll look at that later on. All of these characters are responding to this one action, and the development of the book hinges upon how they respond to an action that happened before the book began. We see Hester's development. How does she grow strong throughout this time? We see Dimmesdale's decline, how he's deteriorating because he will not show his guilt. We see Pearl in her wrestling with who her mother is, who Dimmesdale is, and who she is, and what her purpose is in this world. We see Chillingworth, who grows darker and darker throughout the book and is more and more twisted by his anger and his hate and his desire to destroy Dimmesdale. All of these characters continue to live their lives out in this little Puritan town, and yet each one must hang on to the guilt that they've got in the center of their lives. How do you deal with guilt? Not only that, but the whole plot is complicated by the fact that this is a Puritan society, which, as we mentioned last time, is not particularly tolerant or forgiving. The people of this Puritan society keep coming back to the fact that the sin happened. They love to point the finger at Hester. They love to mock her, and they want to know who the father is. Not only that, but Dimmesdale appears on the surface to be so pure and so good. And so when they see Dimmesdale, they layer on the praise, whereas when they see Hester, they layer on the blame, as well as Pearl. Chillingworth appears to be good in their sight for most of the time, and he attempts to distract them from the fact of what he truly is. All of them, though, are very willing to point the finger and bring up the fact that guilt happened. They are unforgiving and unwilling to ever let go of the past. Yet at the same time, the guilt that they point out in Hester is the guilt they all have in their own hearts. Each of them has committed some kind of crime. Each of them is guilty, but they would rather point the finger at someone else and keep their own sin hidden. It's a complicated topic, and a very relevant one even today. How often do we still see in our society today a single individual isolated and ostracized by the group for being different? Maybe for wearing different clothes, or for speaking differently, or having different ideas. It's so easy to see that this is still abundantly relevant. The Scarlet Letter deals with this idea of pushing someone to the side, marginalizing someone, and what effect that has on everyone. Okay, so let's look at plot. Normally when we think of plot, we think of a diagram that looks something like this. This is called Freytag's triangle, for those of you who are interested. We see an introduction, where we're introduced to our characters. We see rising action. We see a climax. We see falling action. And we have denouement. All of these points we're very familiar with. But you might notice in the Scarlet Letter that he really doesn't have a lot of action. More of it's character development, the development on the inside. What's going on inside these characters' hearts, inside these characters' souls? How does this guilt affecting them on the inside as well as on the surface? So let's touch on our key points of action, and then maybe we can see how the action is developing. Look for patterns. We start out with Hester's punishment. She's being placed upon the scaffold and publicly humiliated for her crime at the very opening of the book. There, Chillingworth comes to town, sees her, recognizes her, and realizes what's happened. He then goes to meet her in the prison afterwards, where he makes a deal with her, and he asks her to keep his secret of who he truly is, so that no one will know that he's the shamed husband. But also, he keeps this secret so that he can sneak in and get to know Dimmesdale and find out who the father truly is. Now, Dimmesdale, at the scaffold scene, could not confess, though Hester was forced to publicly confess her sin. That's important later. At this point, the action really stops. We slowly see the development of Hester's life throughout the next several years, and how she changes over time. She's closed off to the world, she's closed off to society, she's even closed off to herself. We see that the beauty and vibrance that she shows when she's exposed in the scaffold is hidden away and tucked away, which is important through the next several years. We also see the development of Pearl and her character, and how she will not fit into society. 4 years later, we get our first bit of action, and it's brief. It's a moment in which Hester makes a plea to the state to keep her child. She goes to the governor's house, and she asks for assistance, because some people are talking of taking Pearl away from her because of her bad influence by being a sinner. At this point, Dimmesdale stands up, and he intervenes for her. and he helps her to keep her child by making a point in the argument. And at that point, Pearl shows affection to Dimmesdale. This is important because Pearl never shows affection to anyone. So the point at which Pearl shows affection to Dimmesdale, this point reveals that there's some connection between Dimmesdale and Pearl, and that Pearl could become human if only she were connected to a father figure, if only the truth were really out. And Dimmesdale has the opportunity to become a real person. Dimmesdale, by choosing his family, could free himself from the guilt that's weighing him down. At this point, we follow Dimmesdale and his development over these past few years. And we see the effect that Chillingworth has been having on him. And finally, as Dimmesdale's deteriorated, as he's broken apart, and he's beating himself, and he's killing himself inside, and he's preaching these beautiful sermons to his congregation, and everyone loves him and adores him and thinks he's so perfect, but at the same time his great guilt is just pouring down upon him. We come to the very middle of the book. The middle of the book is a scaffold scene. Dimmesdale goes in the middle of the night and stands on the scaffold as if to confess his sin, even though he's confessing it only to the night. He can't confess it during the day, he can't confess it to the congregation, but instead he confesses it to no one in the middle of the night. Hester finds him there and stands with him. The three of them stand together as they ought to have done at the beginning. And in that moment, Dimmesdale seems as if he's going to feel relief, but in the sky there blazes a bright scarlet letter. A comet seems to make this giant letter A in the sky. And not only that, but Chillingworth discovers them there. And Dimmesdale is horrified by Chillingworth and is terrified of who he is. Because he refuses to stand on the scaffold in public with them, Pearl denies him and throws down his hand. We see that contrast between the way Pearl shows him affection here and the way Pearl seems to reject him here, because he refuses to be true to them. After this moment, the action really begins to pick up. Hester, seeing the change in Dimmesdale, we begin to see again further development in Hester and her character and her way of thinking, and we see that after that she decides to challenge Chillingworth. We have a confrontation between the two of them, and Chillingworth, we see, will not back down, and so she breaks her oath to Chillingworth and reveals his identity to Dimmesdale. We have the forest scene, which is key. And at that point, Dimmesdale and Hester, after a great conflict and a great moment of brokenness, they decide to run away together. This moment is coming in contrast to everything that we know they should be doing. Hester has had a better life. Even though she's lived in public mockery, she's developed and she's grown stronger. Dimmesdale, on the other hand, has deteriorated. And yet at this point they both choose Dimmesdale's path, a path of hiding things and secrecy. Ultimately, we realize that Chillingworth finds out about their plot and tries to go with them. And in the end, instead of fleeing, at the moment that Dimmesdale is going to give his great sermon, he confesses to all of the town and dies. But there's a great bit of redemption there. It's very romantic because he dies in his moment of confession, but he's redeemed. Chillingworth's control over him is broken, and he's able to stand on the scaffold at the very end of the book with Hester and Pearl and show the world who he truly is. And by revealing his guilt, he's able to let it go and finally be forgiven of it, finally be redeemed. Now, one key point I'd like to point out. The scaffold is the central symbol throughout this book, along with the Scarlet Letter. It comes at the very beginning of the book. It comes in the dead center of the book, and it comes at the very end of the book. This idea of whether to keep your guilt hidden or make it public is connected with the scaffold. At the opening, Hester is condemned and stands on the scaffold. In the middle, Dimmesdale stands with Hester, but only in private, in the middle of the night. And finally, Dimmesdale stands with Hester and confesses with her. There is just one more key event that needs mentioning. Between the moment when Hester confronts Chillingworth at the ocean and the moment in which Hester feels free in the forest, confesses everything to Dimmesdale, and feels like everything is going to be okay, they almost run away together. There is a moment in which Hester makes a decision, which is fairly central to the whole book. It's the turning point for Hester. It's the moment at which she almost destroys herself. And yet it seems so simple and so small. All throughout the book, Pearl has been fascinated with the Scarlet Letter, and she's always been interested in it. And at this point, she asks her mother what the Scarlet Letter means, and she links it to Dimmesdale and why he always keeps his hand over his heart. She asks, and for a moment, it almost seems as though Hester is going to explain it all to her and be in some way redeemed. And yet, at the same time, in the end, she chooses not to. She says, "What shall I say?" thought Hester to herself. "No, if this be the price for their child's sympathy, I cannot pay it." Then she spoke aloud. "Silly Pearl," said she, "what questions are these? There are many things in this world that a child must not ask about. What know I of the minister's heart? And as for the Scarlet Letter, I wear it for the sake of its gold thread." In all the 7 bygone years, Hester Prynne had never before been false to the symbol in her bosom. It may be that it was the talisman of a stern and severe, but yet a guardian spirit who now forsook her, as recognizing that, in spite of his strict watch over her heart, some new evil had crept into it, or some old one had never been expelled. As for little Pearl, the earnestness soon passed out of her face. In this one moment, by choosing to deny the Scarlet Letter, Hester is setting the path for her own destruction. We've seen what happened to Dimmesdale throughout the book when he denies his crime and throws away his guilt and tries to hide it. And we see that she's beginning to take the same course. This leads to the forest scene and leads to the moment in which Hester and Dimmesdale are about to run away together. We see that this will not be good for them, particularly by what happens to Hester before and by what happens to Dimmesdale after this moment. How this moment, this denial of their guilt, this hiding of their guilt, will only lead them to more pain. And yet, in that moment, she chooses it. We see this is a moment in which the action really rises to a climax, the moment in which we have fears for Hester and for Dimmesdale. We want them to be out from under the horrible eye of this society that condemns them for every breath they take. But at the same time, we want a redemption that's sweet and that will be wholesome and that will make them all better, not something that will continue to rot out their souls. Their true redemption is found in confession and in the scaffold. At the end, Dimmesdale dies, but his death is marked by redemption instead of damnation, something that's incredibly important here. It's much better for him to die in this moment of confession than to live a long life running away from his guilt and constantly having it eat up his soul. In this moment he's free. Chillingworth says, "Hadst thou sought the whole earth over, there was no one place so secret, no high place nor lowly place, where thou couldst have escaped me, save on this very scaffold." That's a brief overview of the key points of the text, who the characters are, and what happens in the book. Next time we'll look much more closely at some of the key passages and how important they are. Hopefully we'll have enough time to go back and look at the end of the book and a few other things like that. Until next time, thanks so much for watching.